we've got now the next 45 minutes, really, of open discussion. I mentioned earlier that we recognised that the expertise was not just confined to those who were presenting, but was throughout the whole of the delegation here to this important workshop. So I would encourage you to take things forward. We have a bit of a challenge, I guess, and the challenge is that really this afternoon is focused on solutions. Now, I think it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, for comments that are made this morning not also to mention solutions. So I would not want to inhibit you doing that, talking about ways forward, and we can log those and take them forward, I think, this afternoon. So if I could open the floor. Sorry? Yeah, I'm being reminded, obviously, that if whoever is making a comment or asking a question would please identify themselves and their affiliation before speaking. Thank you. Yes, thank you.
My name is Joop van Grien from Pain Alliance Europe.
Sorry, could you repeat your affiliation?
Joop van Grien, Pain Alliance Europe.
Yes, thank you.
My question is that everyone is talking about communications and the lack of communications and the worst communication possible. But I didn't hear anything how to change that communication. Is no one thinking about that? Because in the introduction, I heard you say that there's a lack of communication, but I have no idea of what is going to happen with that. Do you have any comment on that?
That's an excellent question. Would anybody care to pick up that suggestion? There were one or two references made to improved earlier communication. Can we pick up on that, perhaps? Yes, thank you.
To respond to that, I outlined that when there is a shortage, I would favor that at an early stage there is an interaction between both industry, EMA, and healthcare professionals and patient representatives to structure the next steps, to make guidelines in collaboration with these parties, to avoid also a slow process of issuing guidelines that perhaps are not completely satisfying for healthcare professionals, etc. So we can learn from what's been seen in the past, as I already discussed with you, to at least try and have a very quick combined discussion and efforts to try to tackle this. And what I also have learned from the other presentations now is that, in my view, there are perhaps two different issues. There is, of course, the issue of preventing the shortage, which is something that mainly, I believe, should be done between industry and regulators. But once there is a shortage, I think we need a sort of management plan as well, including what I just said.
Thank you. And I think we will return to this issue of how we can structure communications better during the course of the afternoon. Thank you. Gareth, thank you.
Gareth Jones, representing the pharmaceutical group of the European Union. So some comments were made by the EHEP about pharmacy generally, and they very much apply to community pharmacy. If I can just maybe pick up a few points specific to community pharmacy. PGU has collected data from its members and has estimated that shortages are taking between 120 and 240 hours of pharmacists' time per annum. I think when you think there are 150,000 community pharmacies across the EU, actually we're losing tens of millions of hours of pharmacists' time every year dealing with this problem. And this is taking pharmacists away from talking to patients, supporting adherence. And so this is a a big health opportunity that's being lost by the time that is being tied up in dealing with this problem. And PG, I've got a number of suggestions, if I can briefly run through those. And the first one is one that's come up a couple of times already, and that's about communication. Supply chain partners should be encouraged to communicate disruptions in the supply chain to community pharmacists once they occur, and to include the cause and the duration of disruptions, because that is key in allowing the pharmacist to respond appropriately to the situation. And also wholesalers should be encouraged to exchange information about minimum stock levels of medicines so shortages can be anticipated. The second point is about the scope of pharmacy practice, and that is that pharmacists should be given greater scope within laws and regulations to manage the situation when it occurs, potentially selecting alternative medicines in collaboration with physicians and patients. And the third point is about national laws and strategies need to put patients first, and these strategies should first and foremost aim to ensure timely and adequate supply of medicines to patients. If I can make one final point, and that is really because the discussion this morning has been slightly broader than the manufacturing and regulatory issues. And the final point is that a number of pharmacies in Europe have to deal with medicines quotas. So regardless of their need for a particular medicine in a particular month, they have a quota for, and if they need more than that quota, it can be very difficult for them to get hold of stock. Now that is probably more closely linked to the economic problem, but it is a big problem that a number of our pharmacies are facing.
Thank you, Gareth. Anybody want to build on those comments or make different comments? Yes, George, thank you.
Yes, George Franz Novartis and representing ISGP today. I just want, in a perspective that was discussed this morning, to believe that when we will thinking about, can say, solution to solve that, there is a kind of extreme situation. It's very difficult to compare a situation when we have, I can say, a kind of a very specific disease with very sophisticated product. I just have an experience about, can say, factor VIII in hemophilia, where I can say it was a very involvement with association of patients is very, very specific. And if you compare this kind of situation of shortage, which is very specific issue of manufacturing at this stage, with, I can say, the point raised, for example, by the FDA, like a generic of injectable, where there is a lot of product, where I can say the globalization of the supply chain is something which is really a key element to follow. If we want to have global solution for such different problem, it will be very difficult. I think one aspect in my thinking, perhaps it will be naive, but it will be to differentiate the kind of shortage that we have. Just a point, Geran.
Thank you for that helpful comment. Yes, we've a comment at the end. Yes, David. Thank you.
It's Richard Bergström again.
Sorry, Richard. My eyesight's bad.
No, I think George is absolutely right. And when I refer to in my presentation to this international coalition, it's not a coalition in the industry. This is actually in the works a coalition between the regulatory authorities. You have these regular meetings, ICTRA and other meetings, but we have been informed that there is a group now working on a more formal umbrella organization for all the global regulatory agencies. You know, and we welcome that, and we think that that's a forum where you could start that discussion. I think to expand a little bit on what has been said, George said it, Carolina raised the issue of prevention or to think ahead. And there are certain things that we can do between ourselves in the industry with stakeholders. We can, and it's absolutely feasible to set up in each country, if we don't have it, mechanisms for where you will be reporting expected disruptions, whether it's manufacturing problems or whether you've actually decided, due to price cut or whatever, you decided that from March next year we're not going to sell this. Today we tell the wholesalers, we put it in the computer system, you can't order it. That's not enough. There should be a mechanism which can actually tell other people that actually from March you won't get this product. And that's certainly more relevant if you're the only supplier. It's less relevant if you're 1 out of 20 generic suppliers in a functioning market, okay? So that's perfectly feasible to do that. There's nothing preventing us from setting up this voluntary self-regulatory system with some facilitation or help from the regulators, okay? We also need one for centrally approved products. I think that's what we should focus on here, because I think there are systems nationally that can maybe be improved and made more public so people are aware of them. But there are certain things that we can't do for competition reasons. And that's something I've been discussing with some of the EMA staff leading up to this meeting, is that will be some sort of reviews, risk reviews of the examples that George mentioned. We've had, in the recent year, more on the US market than in Europe for some reason, disruptions of some very old but very important products. So you have mainstay cancer drugs that are standard in these cocktails we use. So 5-FU, which is very, very, very old. Doesn't cost anything, and maybe that's why it's a problem. Turns out there's only one supplier, one API supplier somewhere. Now, you have a vibrant competitive market with maybe 10 different companies selling the product. And you may think that, well, we have 10 suppliers, it's not a problem. But suddenly they all fall off because the single API producer was shut down by the FDA or something else. That type of analysis we can't do because we're competitors. This is something that the regulators can do and should do. So once you've set up these communication systems and once you have better transparency of the situation, I think the agency should have a work program where you would go through these critical drugs and say, even if you have 20 marketing authorizations, you know in your files that maybe there's only one company doing the bulk manufacturing of the injectable. Maybe there's a contract manufacturer in Germany that's actually selling to 10 different generic companies. And then behind that is only one API supplier. So that's something that needs to be done. For new medicines, patented medicines, you talk to the originator. And there's certainly room for improvement on the side of our members in addressing this with you when you approve the product, to have a discussion about what are your contingencies. But I think we as a matter of urgency, I think, there needs to be a review about these basic standard medicines. Where are they coming from? And what's the backup plans for them? And then I have to say, of course, that, if something has to be done, more than communication, then that takes a discussion involving others than the EMA about, if you want a second manufacturing site worldwide for a particular active substance, when no one's going to offer to do that without knowing that maybe you can increase the price. So the commercial realities are there. The regulators have a role to play where we can't do it ourselves because we are competitors. I would encourage the agency to maybe formulate such a long-term work program.
Okay, perhaps we can return to that this afternoon. I think the work groups that emanated from the reflection paper did to some degree tackle the issue of critical medicines, which will, I think, have an input to make to what you're suggesting. Thank you. Yes, we have a gentleman here.
My name is Alex Senio. I'm a medical oncologist and I'm representing ESMO. And I wanted to speak to what the argument that was before. In fact, our members, medical oncologists, have been in a difficult position lately by exactly the drug shortage of very essential old medicines that are curative for certain cancer patients. And my point is that I want to give you the information that ESMO is planning to do a survey across Europe to see what is the situation regarding drug shortages. We are planning to see how this, we're looking at also at reimbursement, but also at shortages from the point of view of the end user, if you want, the patient. And we have seen a situation very dramatic in which, for instance, in my country, in Romania, very important drugs such as tamoxifen or bleomycin, curative drugs, were missing for a number of months. So the purpose of our survey will be to provide a comprehensive image across Europe on this kind of information, and we're looking to see if EMA is willing to partner and to take this information further to this group. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll find out more about ESMO's plan for that survey. Thank you. Rafe, you look as though you're about to say something.
Yes, thank you, Chair. It was just a thought I had in relation to the discussion.
Could you give your name and affiliation?
Sorry, yes.
I know what it is, but others may not.
Of course. Rafe Savannah, I'm the alternate CHMP member for the United Kingdom and also a member of the CHMP subgroup that's been considering supply issues in the last year or so. So it was coming back to the discussion about communications and the need for early involvement of healthcare professionals and patients, which of course makes clear sense, especially in those scenarios where there's a very specialist, a very highly specialised consideration. A consideration I'm sure we'll come back to this afternoon is how to balance that versus the need which Brendan Cuddy also highlighted in his presentation right at the beginning of the morning for the need for a very careful benefit-risk assessment and the difficulties that are encountered in reaching the conclusions. So very often at CHMP, when we first hear about a potential supply problem, we're waiting on maybe some laboratory results relating to possible out-of-specification findings or contamination, or we're waiting for some inspection findings, and these are some of the elements. Also, we may be waiting for some consideration about the analysis of safety data in terms of what the implications might be for continuing to supply a product which is not GMP compliant. So there are reasons sometimes where for having to delay or take some time over careful decisions before we can actually come to conclusions and communicate definitively. So it was really just to mention that's a tension between wanting to get out there sort of as early as possible about things that people that may already be sort of known about or heard about through the internet, that there may be a supply problem. However, that information gets out, but also the need to be robust in what we do come out with. And I guess, as I said, we'll talk a bit more about that this afternoon.
Thank you, Rafe. That is indeed a tension. Thank you. Other comments? Julie, yes.
Thank you. Just adding on to what has just been said, I think one part of the communication that was highlighted, the problem with communication that was highlighted this morning, is the extent of, or the duration, the foreseen duration. And I think that is also linked, when we're talking about manufacturing or quality issues, that is linked to the extensive process of investigation. And I think, Brendan, earlier in your introduction, you referred to cases where after months of investigation, it's not been pinned down what the root cause is. And I think when talking to companies, some have mentioned past deficiencies by inspectors, highlighting how poor investigations were some years ago. Now I think companies are putting a lot of effort in an investigation, and that is why you cannot readily have an indication of how long will it take, because you haven't had this essential information to help you, which is what is the root cause. So I think it's also important to note that companies have improved. They are doing better investigations nowadays, but that the consequence of that is that you cannot have a ready answer to how long will it last, or at least for a given period of time. So I think it's an important part to keep in mind as well.
Thank you for that. I think Belen from Spain, you were wanting to make a comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerald. First of all, I would like to thank all the panel, because I think there had been many interesting presentations. Well, first of all, my name is Belén Escribano. I work for the Spanish agency. Sorry about that. Well, I have felt really very close to the healthcare professional as well as the patient association when they were saying how frustrating it is, a shortage, because it is also the same for the regulatory authorities when we just have nothing to do to solve it. During this weekend, I received several emails about a shortage of a very old psychiatric medicinal product that we have in Spain, and there is no solution for that till the end of November. And I must tell you that's very, of course, frustrating for the regulatory authorities. I would like also to comment about the notification and communication issues, because I think we more or less solved a bit of that in Spain, because we have a mandatory notification of the shortages from the marketing authorization holders. But then we have a complementary system in which pharmacies and wholesalers may communicate also to the regional authorities, and we have an update every day of those problems. And we are publishing them in our website. And we try also to include the information about the expected date in which the shortage will be solved. But it's quite a big amount of information and it's difficult to handle. And I would say we receive about 85 to 90% of the information about the expected shortages from the marketing authorization holders, and about 10% are just notified by the pharmacies or wholesalers. And it has been mentioned, the cost, as a reason for the shortages. But it has also been explained that to manage a shortage has a cost, a great cost. I would say we spend at the Spanish agency several €100,000 every year, and it's just at the agency. Then we have all the hospitals, we have regional government, special point for dispensing foreign medicines. So it is very important to take care of this and know really that there is also a big cost, and we need to be effective at this moment. So the prevention, I think, and I would like not to anticipate today's afternoon, but the prevention is a key issue in this. And I have heard this morning that the prevention might work and might make possible that there is no shortages of medicinal products. So my comment will be, how could all pharmaceutical companies could commit in taking this good practice and so reducing those shortages? That will be my comment that I would like from the industry to see, because at this moment it's not mandatory to have those practices, and I don't think we want to make mandatory those practices, but we do want pharmaceutical companies to prevent shortages. So what could we do?
Thank you for that comment, Belén. I think it's another plea to move from a reactive approach to being more proactive. Is there any industry comment on that issue of proactivity and prevention? Anders, you wish to make a comment?
Yeah, so both be to that comment and then to the previous comment about investigations. I think when you work in a company and something happens that shouldn't happen, you have a deviation, you're so focused on finding out what was the root cause so we can prevent it from happening again. But it's really, really important, as soon as you have the problem, the first question you ask yourself is does this have product quality impact to the extent that we'll not be able to provide this batch to the market? And that, I think, comes down to training, really, in the companies, to make sure that you think about that early on, about notification to your senior management and notification to relevant health authorities for this thing. So again, I think that's a lot about training and understanding that. One of the things I was thinking about earlier today was, from the time we have decided we need to go and inform the health authority, that is not that the next day the patients will know or the hospitals will know. Then there's some extra communication, and understand that there are also opportunities for improvement there. But I think that whole communication we can definitely do in the industry, do the best we can for all the investigators that are dealing with these deviations. We actually finished a training workshop a month ago for 250 people in how you conduct proper investigations. And that was one of the things we said: every single time you meet, you're going to think about, is this something we need to inform the authorities? But I think we can do better than that as an industry.
Thank you, Anders. I think, John, in your feedback, John Berridge, in your feedback from the ISP survey, you spoke about the impact of the age of plant and the need to invest, and also the corresponding need for regulators to approve such changes in a more timely fashion. Do you want to say more about that? Because I think this is relevant to this issue of preventative, proactive approaches.
I think that to build on the discussions, when we're looking at the shortages that result from manufacturing and quality issues, we have to ask ourselves, what are the true root causes? And they obviously can be many. Some of the shortages simply arise because a decision has been taken that this plant can no longer reliably and robustly manufacture a product to the desired quality standards, and it needs to be updated. I don't want to get into the economics, but of course there will need to be a business strategy decision, and we've heard some of the challenges around the supply of low-cost medicines related there, but that's outside the scope of what I want to say. The challenge now comes as to how long does it take to upgrade a part of the manufacturing chain, and the uncertainties that pertain before one actually gets involved and fully committed to this. I mean, it is actually relevant that just a couple of weeks ago I was sitting in this very same building when we were talking about the revisions to chapters 3 and 5 of GMPs and the setting of health-based limits for shared facilities. This particular element of the of regulatory guidance is still not finished, but it creates uncertainty. And as companies wrestle with their investment strategies, one of the challenges is how to manage that uncertainty. And that's where I think another dimension of this communication is important, because that uncertainty leads to delays. But by creating more opportunity where a company can sit with authorities and say, this is what I'm planning to do, and I know it occurs with some authorities, but it needs to be more uniform. We can remove those uncertainties, and we can increase the likelihood of the investment occurring, the plant being built, the upgrade taking place, whatever it is, and it being approved and brought into production much faster. I think the aspect of metrics and the ability to, for the authorities, for the inspectorate, to be comfortable about the performance of a particular facility that would lead to the more rapid ability to move production from one site to another if there were a particular issue. Let's say you were unfortunate enough to have a fire or a major issue, a flood in one facility. You might want to transfer the production to another facility. If it's going to take you several years to get approval, that's going to be a challenge. What can we do about expediting that ability to move products from one location to another? This timescale, when we started talking to our members, turns out to be far, far longer than we perhaps first envisaged. And I think that once an issue has occurred and you've identified the remediation strategy, engaging with the regulatory agencies to expedite the resolution is going to be important. That's not to diminish the importance of all the training and the corporate culture that tries to prevent these things in the first place, but there were definitely opportunities identified by our survey respondents for significantly facilitating the bringing on stream of backup or contingency manufacturing facilities should the need arise.
Thank you. Engage with the authorities at the earliest possible opportunity, I think, is a key message there, and one that, as a representative of a national authority, I would want to reinforce. We have one speaker here, and then Stefan after that. Thank you, and then George as well.
I'm Gintautas Barcys, Director of Lithuanian Medicines Control Agency, and would like to inform that in the last meeting in Vilnius of Heads of Medicine Agencies...
Could you perhaps speak a little nearer to the microphone? It's not being heard.
This problem was discussed, and proposal was possible to create...
Sorry to interrupt you. Can people hear this? I'm struggling to hear. I'm sorry, would it be possible to move to the microphone next to you? Brian, do you mind sharing that? I don't know what's wrong with that, but there appears not to be transmitting very much.
Perhaps it's better. I would like to inform that in the last meeting of Heads of Medicines Agencies in Vilnius, problem of shortages was discussed between Heads of Medicine Agencies, and the proposal was possible to create some system of managing of shortages in EU. And decision was made that possible in next meeting of Heads of Medicines Agencies in November, we will create this task force or working group. So I think it will be interesting discussions and interesting solutions after.
Just before you leave, could you repeat the forum in which that discussion is going to take place? I didn't catch. Would you mind?
This discussion take place in meeting of Heads of Medicine Agencies of European Union in Vilnius last September.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Stefan, you have a comment, and then George.
Stefan Rönninger for PDA. What we also hear from our people in PDA is that, especially what was said by John regarding the new requirements in Chapter 5, now also excipients are in the scope. Excipients should be inspected, excipients should have a better oversight, excipients should follow GMP, and what is reported in PDA more and more often is that excipients manufacturers are not prepared to fulfill this high standard because they are manufacturing, let's say, 1,000 tons per day for a specific use and 100 kilo per year for pharmaceutical use. And they are not prepared to support these excipients anymore, which also can get a big hurdle for the established medicines, because then you have to file changes of excipients if it's not anymore available and so on. So it's a big hurdle. And what I said, especially what was mentioned by Richard on the 5FU, fluuracil, I think this dedicated facilities is a clear example where you really, regulations made a pushback because you have to make in the dedicated facility. And it's such a cheap product which you can easily make and also very easily clean without any residual on the surface.
Thank you, Stefan, for raising that additional issue, which is the impact of the 45 Medicines Directive on excipients. Thank you for that. George.
Yeah, George Rösling, PDA Europe. We do a lot of training courses, and we see in the training courses there are some topics which always come up, and we see this also in the inspection, or from inspection we hear that these problems come up. And there are some uncertainties, and at these training courses it would be really helpful if we could do this together with regulators, with inspectors, because there's often uncertainty what is really required. And we are doing training courses meanwhile with PICS, inspectors from PICS. And we recognize it's also some uncertainty on the side of the inspectors. What would be the right approach? And therefore, I think it would be very helpful if we look at observations from the inspectors and use this as a material for training of industry and regulators. I think this would be a real good approach. Often companies are a little bit reluctant sharing what kind of observations were made, and they don't want to share it. But you can see from the discussions I have with them during the training that there is definitely a need. Just to mention things like visual inspection, we always hear how many problems come up, and people ask a lot about what is the best approach to do it. And I think if we would do this together with the regulators, with the inspectors, this would have a great impact on improving the situation. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for that. There is a precedent for regulatory agencies working with professional associations on training and seminars and so on, and I hope that will continue. Thank you. Any other comment, question? Yes, the lady here.
Hi, it's Nina Straten from the European Hematology Association. I think before moving on to discuss solutions in the second session, it might be good to achieve a form of consensus on the problem. And with regard to that, I had a question for Richard Bergstrom, because in your presentation you discussed shortages in a broader sense. But did I understand correctly that the type of shortage discussed at this meeting, shortages due to quality and manufacturing issues, are not considered to be a systematic issue by industry at the moment?
It's a big problem for us when it happens, but we have no sign that it's growing in problem. Okay, so the examples you heard with Calyx, with the enzyme replacement products, those are really sad instances, and they are catastrophic for patients and for the companies. But I don't see that they are increasing. We have them, unfortunately, every year. There's something. The things that seem to be increasing when we listen to our customers is the disruptions to actually patient supplies of medicines that are available. They are there, they are being shipped to the markets, but somehow, they don't get them. And it's the issue that we can come back to with the APIs and the vulnerability of a global commoditized supply chain. I think the challenge is going to be, again, that at some stage, there'll be, for many of these issues, there'll be a question of commercial aspects. And I think this is something to come back to after lunch. How do we somehow manage, this is not the EMA's responsibility, but somehow is there a way in which there could be created a fora to having that discussion? So if the society wants 5 FU supplies to be made more secure, there must be some discussion with hospital purchasers, with pricing reimbursement agencies about actually doing something. We have, if I make the parallel with other areas, there are areas where we're not doing enough of research, like antibiotics, like I talked about, countermeasures against infectious disease and so on, where people are discussing or doing advanced purchase commitments, or you say, okay, fine, we can do a price revision. In France, the French government allowed last year the prices to be increased for some 50, I think it was, or even more, very old products that had the same price or price cut since the 50s and the 60s. So they acknowledge that these products are important, and we can't go on paying less than candy for these medicines. So we are allowing an increase. The total budget for the French government of doing that, total cost, is negligible because the volumes are so small. But still, that type of acknowledgement from government. I know some pricing reimbursement agencies, like the one in Sweden, acknowledge this and have exceptionally agreed to increase prices of products because companies have argued that we need to do this upgrading of a facility. So I know this is not the EMA's responsibility, but I think in order to have something which is really addressing all of this, there needs to be a forum for then also the industry to be allowed to come and say, well, if we need to build another factory, that's going to cost you money. We will have, it's unavoidable at one stage for those types of problems. And I know we are all, I think, sort of
Nina,
complicating the matters, but it's a reality.
Nina, you raised a very important, I think, point that we, in terms of the problem statement. Thank you for that. Do you want to continue? Do you want to pursue this further? Because clearly it is important.
I just add one more question. So the specific type of shortage that, for example, was mentioned in the ISPER report could be solved by changes in industry management are not perceived to be systematic at the moment or growing, is how do you define it?
Just the fact that you have two professional organizations with members that work in the industry and from regulators. Now, two very competent organizations here are actively addressing this with different meetings. is a sign that the industry is taking this very seriously. And I think that type of peer pressure or and so on is building, and that's going to improve that side of this problem. But there is another side of the problem which is not about attention or procedures or attitude or so on, which is actually not going to go away. And that's the global supply chain aspects, the commoditization of many products, the competition, the flows in Europe and so on. And these things are unfortunately outside the EMA remit. And you may say that we're not going to deal with these going forward, that's fine. But then we are admittedly not engaging in half of the problems. I don't want to get into a debate about whether these aspects are 30 or 70% of the problem. I don't know. There's no point in getting into that. The fact is that we have some issues that are clearly regulatory, quality assurance, risk management within industry. And then there's the other issue, which is more the commercial realities.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for raising the issue. Clearly, the European Hospital Pharmacist Group, over 70% thought the problem was getting worse, and that's a perception that others have. I've got a number of hands and a number of people wanted to speak. Bernadette, I think you were first. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerald. Bernadette Sinclair Jenkins from the MHRA, and I work very closely with my colleague at the Ministry of Health concerning shortages in particular caused or linked to quality of medicines issues. And I would like to comment on the statement that whether the situation is improving or getting worse. And from a national perspective, I can only say it's got worse. And that's based on the volume of referrals and cases, or number of cases that we're having to manage, including those that need European network input. So I think I would just comment that we certainly have seen an increase in cases of potential shortages linked to quality problems.
Okay, thank you for that. Two at the back, I think it was Stefan and Anders. Was it Stefan? No? Sorry, forgive me, John and Anders. And then a gentleman here as well. We'll come to you. Can you make your comments fairly brief? Because clearly there are a number of people who wish to speak before lunch. Thank you.
Yeah, for me, that was a problem statement. And I agree with all the things that Richard said about there are many different reasons for drug shortages. Brandon said it very clear in the beginning. Now we're talking about things related to the reflection paper. So things that are related to manufacturing quality issues. So, so today that's what I will be speaking to, of course, as well. I think when we do that, it's very, very important that we also think about, to get out of the situation we're in right now, we probably need to think different from what we've been thinking before. And we can, from industry, do the best we can in terms of doing things like what John said about putting new facilities online or something like that. But we can't do it in isolation. We need to have a dialogue. We need to talk about individual cases. What can we do to not set in a negative way, cut corners, but what can we do to make sure the patients actually get the product, and finding ways where it's safe, it's efficacious, it's good quality, but there might be something like a process validation that is concurrent instead of having been done so and so many batches and what have you. So I think it's a dialogue we really need, but we'll keep the, at least from my side, to what Brandon said was the scope today. So I just want to be clear on that from my side.
Thank you. John, did you have a comment you wanted to make briefly?
But just very briefly, it's actually quite hard to get a true picture across the whole of Europe on the extent of the problem associated with manufacturing and quality. All I can say to you is that from our survey and the intelligence that we got from a US perspective, the FDA have said that drug shortages, the major cause of drug shortages is manufacturing and quality, resulting in 46% of the shortages in 2011. From our survey, we had 264 people respond. 212 of those had experienced shortage. So it's significant. Whether it's getting bigger or smaller, I can't say. How it pertains across Europe is difficult to say. And that's maybe something where working together with the national competent authorities, we could do some useful scholarship to understand more on these causes, the prevalence and rate of increase or decrease as various measures are taken. I think once we define the problem and we think we have some routes to success, we need to be able to measure how successful our proposed actions are going to be. So we need to know what success will look like.
There's a gentleman on the right, René, is it, I think?
Thank you, René Jenny from GIRP, the European Association of Pharmaceutical Full-Line Wholesalers. First of all, let me say that our association is fully in line with Richard Bergström. I will not come back on that. Let me just bring in the discussion a fact who was not mentioned this morning. In some countries, and I'm sure you're all aware about that, in some countries, 6 or 7 countries in Europe, the wholesalers are submitted to a public service obligation. This means that they must have a certain stock level of certain medicines, that they must have that they have the obligation to deliver all healthcare providers. I think this could be an efficient way to solve some disruption problems. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that important point. We wish to break for lunch reasonably early because I have good information that there is a competing and larger group who will be seeking to use the restaurant at about 1 o'clock. So I wish to get there before they do. But we still have a little time. If there are a couple of final comments that anybody wishes to make or questions that they wish to raise. Brendan, sorry. You.
No, I'd just like to come back to this idea of, is the problem getting bigger or smaller? And maybe one confounding factor is that we as authorities put a lot of effort into preventing the shortages, and we're not measuring that, perhaps, or not communicating that. And that's why I put that on my slide this morning, that, we had quite a number of reports this year of problems with potential shortages due to manufacturing or quality problems, where we were able to prevent those shortages from occurring in the first place. And unfortunately, in a couple of cases, we weren't able to do that. So I think perhaps, maybe it's a question of methodology and what are we actually looking at? Are we all measuring the same things? It's easy to focus on the cases that get into the public domain, but certainly from our perspective, we've seen an increase in the number of cases where we have to put more effort into assessing and preventing those shortages. And we prevent in many different ways. But I think it's worth making that point, that it's not just as easy as measuring how many shortages you have.
And I think I was going to give you the last word, Brendan, but as I insulted Julie by misassigning her association, perhaps you could have the last word, Julie.
Thank you. I'll be very short, but I think one important point, we talked about communication this morning. We saw from many organizations, professional organizations, a number of surveys being done. I think in terms of whether the problem is increasing or not, the fundamental discussion and reflection we need to have is, what are we talking about? And can we get to a definition of what we're defining? Because we talk about shortages, but we understand, everybody understands different things behind it. And Brendan was referring to methodology, and I'm referring to semantic, maybe, discussion. But I think these are fundamental if we want to get the building bricks right from the first place, because otherwise we can keep discussing solutions, but not having the same problem in mind.
A very important and well-made point, and I hope that during this afternoon, as we get feedback from the working groups and so on, that we'll be able to define that more accurately.